Instead of very angry, use furious, furious. Instead of very beautiful, use gorgeous, gorgeous. Instead of very big, use massive, massive. Instead of very boring, use dull, dull. Instead of very noisy, use deafening, deafening. Instead of very poor, use destitute, destitute. Instead of very cheap, use stingy, stingy. Instead of very clean, use spotless, spotless. Instead of very short, use brief, brief. Instead of very difficult, use arduous, arduous. Instead of very dry, use arid, arid. Instead of very quick, use rapid, rapid. Instead of very bad, use awful, awful. Instead of very smart, use intelligent, intelligent. Instead of very sad, use sorrowful, sorrowful. Instead of very upset, use distraught, distraught. Instead of very cold, use freezing, freezing. Instead of very strong, use forceful, forceful. Instead of very huge, use colossal, colossal. Instead of very calm, use serene, serene. Instead of very ugly, use hideous, hideous. Instead of very small, use petite, petite. Instead of very funny, use hilarious, hilarious. Instead of very quiet, use hushed, hushed. Instead of very rich, use wealthy, wealthy. Instead of very expensive, use costly, costly. Instead of very dirty, use filthy, filthy. Instead of very tall, use towering, towering. Instead of very easy, use effortless, effortless. Instead of very wet, use soaked, soaked. Instead of very slow, use sluggish, sluggish. Instead of very good, use excellent, excellent. Instead of very stupid, use idiotic, idiotic. Instead of very happy, use ecstatic, ecstatic. Instead of very exciting, use exhilarating, exhilarating. Instead of very warm, use hot, hot. Instead of very weak, use frail, frail. Instead of very little, use tiny, tiny. Instead of very bright, use luminous, luminous. Instead of very busy, use swamped, swamped. Instead of very careful, use cautious, cautious. Instead of very clear, use obvious, obvious. Instead of very colorful, use vibrant, vibrant. Instead of very confused, use perplexed, perplexed. Instead of very creative, use innovative, innovative. Instead of very crowded, use bustling, bustling. Instead of very dear, use cherished, cherished. Instead of very deep, use profound, profound. Instead of very empty, use desolate, desolate. Instead of very excited, use thrilled, thrilled. Instead of very fancy, use lavish, lavish. Instead of very fat, use obese, obese. Instead of very friendly, use amiable, amiable. Instead of very glad, use overjoyed, overjoyed. Instead of very great, use terrific, terrific. Instead of very heavy, use leaden, leaden. Instead of very hungry, use starving, starving. Instead of very hurt, use battered, battered. Instead of very large, use huge, huge. Instead of very lazy, use indolent, indolent. Instead of very long, use extensive, extensive. Instead of very loose, use slack, slack. Instead of very accurate, use exact, exact. Instead of very afraid, use fearful, fearful. Instead of very clever, use intelligent, intelligent. Instead of very cute, use adorable, adorable. Instead of very dull, use tedious, tedious. Instead of very eager, use keen, keen. Instead of very evil, use wicked, wicked. Instead of very fast, use quick, quick. Instead of very fierce, use ferocious, ferocious. Instead of very light, use luminous, luminous. Instead of very lively, use animated, animated. Instead of very lovely, use adorable, adorable. Instead of very mean, use cruel, cruel. Instead of very messy, use slovenly, slovenly. Instead of very nice, use kind, kind. Instead of very often, use frequently, frequently. Instead of very old, use ancient, ancient. Instead of very open, use transparent, transparent. Instead of very pale, use ashen, ashen. Instead of very perfect, use flawless, flawless. Instead of very powerful, use compelling, compelling. Instead of very pretty, use beautiful, beautiful. Instead of very rainy, use pouring, pouring. Instead of very scared, use petrified, petrified. Instead of very scary, use chilling, chilling. Instead of very sharp, use keen, keen. Instead of very shiny, use gleaming, gleaming. Instead of very shy, use timid, timid. Instead of very simple, use basic, basic. Instead of very skinny, use skeletal, skeletal. Instead of very smooth, use sleek, sleek. Instead of very soft, use downy, downy. Instead of very sorry, use apologetic, apologetic. Instead of very special, use exceptional, exceptional. Instead of very sure, use certain, certain. Instead of very sweet, use thoughtful, thoughtful. Instead of very talented, use gifted, gifted. Instead of very tasty, use delicious, delicious. Instead of very thirsty, use parched, parched. Instead of very tight, use constricting, constricting. Instead of very tiny, use minuscule, minuscule. Instead of very tired, use exhausted, exhausted. Instead of very willing, use eager, eager. Instead of very windy, use blustery, blustery. Instead of very wise, use sage, sage. Instead of very worried, use distressed, distressed.